In today's video, I'm going to talk to Andre. Now, Andre and his wife have done well as they prepare to retire, but they still have concerns. Most of their money is in pre-tax accounts, and so they have concerns about implementing the right Roth conversion strategy, IRMA surcharges, keeping income low enough to qualify for certain health insurance subsidies. What we do in today's video is walk Andre through a projection of what his future might look like to help him understand what to do to optimize what he's worked for and avoid key pitfalls along the way. On today's episode of the Retirement Makeover, we have Andre. Andre, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, James.
Well, you are 56, your wife is 55. You have expressed a desire to work 5 more years or so until retirement. Investment value, a little north of $2 million or so. As you think about this, Andre, and maybe you and your wife talk about this, what are the biggest challenges that come to mind as you think about your retirement?
So, like you said, we're thinking about retiring in 5 years. And for us, for myself, for the most part, the age or the time in the workforce where you're busy accumulating assets is one thing, but there's a lot of moving pieces for us, particularly for us thinking about retiring at age 61 for myself. Between that 61 and 65 time frame, there's a lot of moving pieces in terms of the right time to do Roth conversions. The vast majority of our assets are in pre-tax accounts. So when to do Roth conversions at scale? What about the impact on IRMA surcharges, the affordability aspect of the ACA insurance for that gap year between an employer's insurance policy and Medicare? There's a lot of moving pieces for us between 61 and 65 for me. And for me, that's the most confusing aspect of planning for retirement is what is that going to look like for me 5 years from now? And what can I get my head around now that will impact some of those decisions that I have to make then?
Yeah. Let's assume that you didn't wrap your head around that and you did retire in 5 years. What's the concern of that scenario of, oh, we didn't optimize this? Is there a specific concern, or is it more just wanting to make sure that you're optimizing what you have?
Well, one that comes up most often, like I said, most of our assets are in pre-tax accounts, and we're still contributing heavily to those, and do have some concerns about taxation, especially in the out years for that with the impact on from RMDs. I've run several analyses that show the first couple of years of retirement for us that there may be some room for large scale Roth conversions, several $100,000. And that's something that I really don't want to get wrong. So for me, that's front and center in terms of the biggest question mark around that time frame.
Yeah. The impact of that decision is leveraged as the value of your portfolio grows, of course. And so it becomes of increasing importance. What's the significance of 5 years from now? Is that somewhat arbitrary, or is there something happening in 5 years that you and your wife are saying that's the natural time to do this?
Part of it's arbitrary. We could probably retire before then if needs be, but my wife is in a job that she's very good at and that she enjoys. We do want to take some time for ourselves. And for me, it was difficult to work around some of the issues with retirement income before age 59 and a half. So I was thinking 60, 61 is going to be kind of the right time where a lot of these pieces will start to fall into play and be more feasible for income generation.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, let's take a look. Let's take a look at your financial situation right now and start to go where I would go first if I was to look at this to help unpack some of these things. So I'm just going to share my screen here. And this is just a blueprint. So as we look at your high level overview, as we talked about 56 and 55, various assets, whether they're 401ks, or I should say IRAs, SEP IRAs, different investment accounts, about 2.2 of that net worth, 2.2 million or so, is in investments. I'm sorry, 2.6. Some of that is college plans. So we're really not earmarking it for your planning, but it's part of what you have. And then, of course, the rest here. And as you mentioned, I think one of the planning challenges is a lot of these are pre-tax accounts, which is great. You've gotten the tax deduction as you put that money in. But at some point, there's going to come a tax bill owed on this. Where we want to start is never really directly with the tax planning stuff, because the tax planning kind of follows your ability to create income to support the goals that you have. And so we really want to support some of the goals on this, Andre. So 61 and 60, that's 5 years from today. So that's the goal that you expressed of when you want to retire. Can you walk us through some of these expenses and whether these are expenses that you're pretty confident you will have, or whether they're just things that you're using as a placeholder and not really too sure about? what the actual amount will be?
I would say it's mostly that. Right now, that's a proxy for our current monthly expenditures. But right now, we have two kids at home. They're older kids, but they're still at home, and there'll be a lot of different moving pieces at 5 years from now than there are now. Some of those are fixed, not so much the mortgage. The mortgage will be going away over a 5 year period. But for example, my wife is an equestrian, and that's a sizable monthly expense, and she will want to keep riding during retirement. So that's a couple $1,000s a month in terms of ongoing expenses. Other stuff there, some of it's fixed, but the majority of that $12,000 that I'm looking at on the screen there is kind of a proxy for current expenditures, not so much on the drilling down in more detail on what the budget will be 5 years from now.
Okay, great. Let's circle back there. So that 12,000 is a current estimate of current expenditures. Granted, today there's two children that are also contributing to that in terms of expenses. There's a mortgage that's contributing to that in terms of expenses. So may certainly look different in the future. What about these expenses here? Are these things that you have projected out of we'll need a new car every so often, or is it just an estimate of wanting to make sure something's included there?
Right, that's projected out in terms of our existing car purchase record, if you will. We're doing a new car about every 7 to 8 years. So I think I budgeted for about that amount every 7 years.
Yep.
And then the vacation, we will want to be doing more travel, especially in the early years of retirement. And so I think I put that on for every 2 years, possibly more often than that, if we could, especially for the first 10 years, and then we'd reassess.
Yeah. Very good. So this is a goal that if you could, you would love to enhance that. And what does that mean? Does that mean spending more every other year, or does that mean maybe not having to limit it to once every other year?
Yes. Yes to both.
To both. Great. Joint gifting to kids. Tell me more about that.
Again, more of a placeholder, an idea, or an ideal, I should say. And that's going to be to help him out with a down on a house, or possibly a wedding. Don't know if that's going to happen, when that's going to happen, but I think I put that in there for a total of 4 occasions, and that would be about 40,000 a piece-ish for that gifting.
Perfect. So these are the goals. And so we're starting with this because essentially the question is, can the assets that we have support these goals that we have? Today, salary is covering all of our expenses. So these monthly expenses, any vacations we take, any cars that we purchase, but that salary is going to go away, of course, in a few years. And so if we do flip the switch and start looking at income, we see current income. Social Security, you had talked about in just some ahead of time, ideally collecting at age 70. Is that correct? What is your thought process on Social Security?
Yeah, again, with most of our assets in pre-tax accounts, we were thinking about ways to rationalize our tax exposure during those first 10 years. And I think we probably have enough in those in the accounts that can support our expenses without having to claim Social Security. I like the idea of that being a backup pension plan and to maximize that income for both of us, and that means collecting at 70.
Yeah,
but I'm not absolutely married to that idea, and I would be willing to entertain other options. But the numbers that I've run suggest that for what we're thinking that's going to do with our portfolio and our income, that 70 is probably the right place to start.
Okay, very good. And so as we're looking at this and we have numbers plugged in, these monthly benefits are what you would currently be projected to receive at your full retirement ages, you and your wife, age 67. But because we are going to now increase this to collecting at 70, there's 3 years of delayed retirement credit. So the actual benefit that you'll receive would be greater than that, plus, of course, inflation adjustments between now and then. Some self-employment income here. Talk about this. So joint inheritance, you're expecting a fairly sizable amount. Is that something that you're expecting to receive in the form of cash or investments? Is that real estate? Is that a business?
It would be from in-laws and from my mother. That's a rough approximation for what I think that's going to look like. It could be less. I really don't know what form that's going to be, if that's going to be in the form of an inheritable IRA or cash or property or any number of other myriad formations or manifestations. I think that's a consolidated approximate amount, knowing what I do about their assets.
Okay.
And their and their estates.
Very good. And you have this for a little over 10 years from now. Obviously, this is something that's probably a lot of an unknown. What form is that come in? What's the actual amount? What are their long-term needs with the rest of their lifetime? So there's just a lot of variables, but including it here is something. I want to now go to before taxes. What do cash flows look like? So this is always the lifeblood of what we're going to start with. So we know what assets are today. We know what income sources, at least we know what we're going to project into the future, which is just what we looked at. The question is, what will this look like in retirement? Will we have enough in retirement? And so if you're going to retire at 61 and 60, we want to have a general breakdown of what will salary look like. And really, this is the first full year of retirement here. I do still see some self-employment income that we looked at before. Just want to confirm that's correct, Andre, of that will likely continue for some time.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So there's still some income coming in, as we see here. On top of that, you see other inflows. So inheritance, for example, projected in 2035. Other income flows here starting at age 70, Social Security kicks in. The reason these numbers are significantly higher than we looked at just a couple minutes ago is because delayed retirement credits are increasing your full retirement age amount from 67 till age 70. Plus, there's cost of living adjustments that are happening every single year just with inflation between now and the time that this actually comes into play. So these are the income sources we can plan for. Here's your total inflows on this side. But we always have to compare what income sources will we have, excluding investments to start, and what are our projected expenses at that time. So expenses are everything from living expenses, which is the $12,000 per month that we started with, which I want to revisit in just a second here, to housing. You see, even once principal and interest are paid off, that doesn't mean housing expenses go away. There's still property taxes, there's still insurance, there's still maintenance that we're planning for around that. There's healthcare expenses, so on and so forth. And so as we start adding all that stuff up, then of course these numbers are adjusted for inflation. $12,000 per month is $144,000 per year, but that's today. So if we have, 10 years of inflation, we're projecting just under 200,000 of actual expenses at that time. So the bottom line is when we add all of that up, project out some projected tax payments, here's the total expenses we're actually planning for. And when we compare the actual expenses to the income flows you'll have to support them, self-employment income, Social Security, inheritance, so on and so forth, there's going to be a gap. So the net flows here, whenever we see a negative, that's saying that's what you have to draw from your portfolio to fill that gap. So we know that there's going to be a gap. That's why we save. That's why we invest, so that we have something to create that income. The question is, do we have enough of a portfolio to fill that gap, to not just provide income at age 61 and 62 and 63, but also at age 73 and at age 83 and potentially at age 93, depending on how long we live. So I'm going to come back to this in a second. What I want to do next is go to the tax piece. But any questions, Andre, so far as we're going through this, or does that make sense?
So far, so good.
Okay. That's a quick flyby. I'm coming back to that, but I want to start with the tax piece because I know that was one of your questions: is what do we do when there's Roth conversions here? There's ACA subsidies that we need to think about. There's IRMA surcharges. As we come in here and think about this, there's a couple things. One is income taxes, and income taxes that we might expect to pay are largely going to be driven by how are we pulling money out of our portfolio. So, even just withdrawal sequence, are we taking money pro rata? Meaning we're pulling, if we have $1 million in our portfolio and 100,000 is in brokerage account and 900,000 is in an IRA, well, then 10% comes from the brokerage and 90% comes from the IRA, and just take proportionately. That's one option. We can take from taxable accounts first, IRAs next, and SEP IRAs next, and then Roth IRAs. So there's all these different ways to do it. We're starting just with taxable, then tax deferred, and then tax free, which in many cases is a great place to start, but not necessarily always. What this is looking at is your projected taxable income. So it's going straight to the heart of the question of, should we be doing Roth conversions? What about Medicare surcharges? What about some of these other things? And so what this is looking at here is this purple bar, or this purple portion of the graph, is showing what Andre and Andre's wife projected taxable income is going to be starting today, projected out into the future. And what you see is you can get rid of these overlays here real quick. Over the next few years, you have income from work and from earnings. And so you're going to have taxable income that's exactly where it's been the last few years, assuming income is the same. What happens here is retirement happens. And when you retire, you're living, going back to the withdrawal sequence, on your taxable accounts first, which means your tax bracket goes way down. Now it pops back up. And the reason it pops back up after a few years is, to your point, Andre, of a lot of your accounts are pre-tax, the majority of them are. So you don't have a full amount in your brokerage account to live forever. So at some point, you spend those down. And once you spend those down, the system, or the software in this case, is going to revert back to, now we're spending IRA funds to meet our needs, which is the reason this jumps back up, because now you're pulling money from an IRA to live on, which is fully taxable. Then it drops again. And the reason it's dropping is because we're modeling out that inheritance. Okay, if 1.25 million comes in, and for the sake of this, we're just assuming that's cash or investments, not an inherited IRA or something else of that nature. Well, now you do have taxable assets to live on again, which means, again, if chosen to do so, you have the opportunity to keep your income much lower at that point. And then in the future, RMDs start, you spend down some of the brokerage assets, and now you're living on fully taxable money, again, as you pull it out. So far, so good, or any questions on that?
Yeah, just wondering why the spikes are there at like 77 and 85. Are those different income streams in terms of Social Security spikes?
These spikes are going to be things like maybe home improvement, gifting to kids, car purchases. And so we're projecting out a fairly static expense line of 12,000, but then we have those goals. Hey, every 7 years, we're going to buy a car. Every so often, we're going to gift money to children. At the end, we're projecting out long-term care expenses. And so, I mean, that's a big unknown here. That's the reason for a more dramatic spike. So this is just reflecting the timing of the different goals that we put in to account for those things.
Okay.
What we want to do now is overlay different tax brackets. So that's your taxable income, but what does that tell us? Not a whole lot, unless we know what the different tax brackets are. And what this is showing is it's saying, look, you're probably going to be in the 22 to 24% tax bracket for these years here. Then you drop way down to potentially the 0% tax bracket if you're just living on your brokerage account that year. Then you pop back up, then you're back down. And these valleys, so if you kind of think of this as like a mountain range, the top of the mountain means you're in a higher tax bracket. Probably not the time to be doing Roth conversions. Bottom of this, these valleys, you're in a very low tax bracket. Those are the years we should at least be really strongly thinking about. Do we shift money from IRAs to Roth IRAs, from pre-tax accounts to after-tax accounts? And as is the case here, most people's projection is not just one smooth, here's exactly when you do it and here's when you stop doing it. You can see for various reasons, like the inheritance coming in or spinning down various accounts. This isn't going to be perfectly even, but what we want to start thinking about is, can we, in any year that we're in the 10% tax bracket or under, can we fill up that 10% tax bracket? So in other words, if the 10%, I'm just going to use round numbers, if the 10% tax bracket goes up to $25,000 per year for married family joining at this time, and we're only showing $10,000 of income, let's do a $15,000 conversion to fill that up, because we gladly pay tax at 10% to avoid having to pay them at 28%, 32%, whatever it is in the future. And you can see that these are the years where you'd be doing that. You have to really get close in here to see, because it's a relatively small line, but here's what your taxable income looked like prior. Here's what it looks like if you do those conversions. Not dramatically different, but as you're seeing in those valleys, at least fill up the 10% tax bracket. That alone adds pretty significantly to the tax adjusted ending portfolio balance. So it's a great place to start, but we want to say, well, what if we do that to the 12% tax bracket? And what we start to see is, in some ways, that backfired. So why do we have less money for doing so? And I want to come back to this. So put a bookmark in this. I'm going to come back to it because that's probably somewhat counterintuitive to start. But we don't only want to do this with ordinary income taxes. We also want to understand, what does this look like with Medicare premium tax brackets? You can see here's the various levels of Medicare surcharges. And so we can't just look at federal income taxes. We also have to look at state income taxes. We also have to look at Medicare premium tax brackets. We can also look at, what does this do to the capital gains tax bracket that we might be in. So does this make sense so far, or any questions on what we're looking at?
So far, so good.
Okay. I'm going to go back to this projection here, where we're saying, why does it cost us money to convert only up to the 12% bracket? And one of the reasons we have to keep in mind that when you're doing a Roth conversion, and I like to make this very clear for people, it doesn't actually feel good when you're doing it, because it means you're prepaying taxes that might not otherwise be due for a decade, for 2 decades, for a very long time once required distributions actually kick in. And so in this case, and this isn't always the case, but we have to ask ourselves, what's the impact of required distributions? Because for most people, the goal of Roth conversions is saying, look, I'm projecting out my income in the future, and required distributions are actually going to push me into a much higher tax bracket than I want to be in. In other words, like I'm being forced to take out 100,000 per year from my IRAs when I only need 40,000 to supplement Social Security and meet all my needs, for example. So the fact that I'm being forced to take out 100,000, well, it's pushing me into this tax bracket that I really don't want to be in. Compare that to the person that says, "Hey, I'm going to be taking out 100,000 anyways because I just need that's what it's going to cost to fund my lifestyle." Well, if required distributions are forcing you to take 100, that's not as quote unquote bad because you would have taken it anyways. And so that's where I want to go back here real quick. Go back to your cash flows. As we went to this page and we started looking at what are we projected to have to take out each year, I want to fast forward to when required distributions kick in. So if you see this column here called planned distributions, this is projecting out how much your required distributions will be once they start at age 75. So yours would start first, Andre. Your wife's would start second just because of the 1 year age difference. Here's the amount that you're going to be forced to take. Now, add that to your Social Security. So that's the majority of what this income is right here, is Social Security. And what you see is your total income. Let's use 2044 as an example. 150,000, I believe that's just Social Security. Yeah, it's just Social Security at that time. 2045. So 150,000 of Social, I'm sorry, 2044, 150,000 of Social Security, $200,000 of projected required distributions, 350,000 of total income flows. So you have 350,000 of income, including your required distributions, but your total projected expenses are going to be 410,000. Meaning even with the required distribution in these projections, you're still going to need to take another 57,000 or so from your IRA. So on the one hand, yeah, these are significant required distributions, but on the other hand, you would be taking them anyways if we are trying to meet these goals that we looked at of maintaining these expenses. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Here's what I think the planning dashboard you made an excellent point. Okay, this is just an estimate of current expenses. One of the hardest parts about retirement planning for most people, what are expenses going to be at that time? And not just year one of retirement, but year 5, year 10, year 20. To some extent, it is just a guessing game. But I want to come back to this because this is actually going to really tie into your tax strategy. And what I mean by that is let's start going and looking at this. This is what your portfolio is projected to look like. We're making some big assumptions here. One of the assumptions is that your portfolio, Andre, will grow by just under 7% per year or so between now and retirement, and then closer to about 6% per year in retirement. It's not a guarantee. That's not recommending you invest a certain way. It's just us starting with something. What's the projected growth that we're going to assume? And we can adjust that up or down to see how do different growth rates impact that. So I'll do that in a second. But what this is showing is this is saying, here's your portfolio today. You're going to continue saving. You're going to retire right about here. You're going to start spending down your assets in those first few years when there's no Social Security to support any of your income needs, and a big brunt of the heavy lifting is put on your portfolio. Then there's an inheritance that bumps up your portfolio. Then you keep spending that. And over time, you see a really dramatic drop down here. That's just because of long-term care expenses. And again, I want to say these are big assumptions. We have no idea if those are going to happen or not. So that's just something we include in planning to make sure that we're not overlooking it. The thing that I don't believe is realistic is these $12,000 of expenses. This includes a mortgage payment that will go away at some point. Yes, property taxes and insurance remain, maintenance remains, principal and interest go away. This includes expenses for 2 children that are at home. That's going to go away at some point. Do you happen to know what the principal and interest portion of your mortgage is?
1580.
1580. And if you had to estimate, how much is it costing extra groceries, activities, whatever it is for 2 children?
On a monthly basis, 1,000.
So let's say that there's $2,500 a month that you are spending now that you won't have in retirement, even if everything else stays the same, just because those children expenses and principal and interest expenses will go away. What that means is we can plug in 9,500 here, not because we're telling you to take a pay cut, just because you're no longer paying the bank and paying for extra stuff. And if we rerun that one simple change has a dramatic impact on this. If we look at the probability of success, it jumps from 42%, which is not the greatest probability of success that we want to see, to probably much more realistic 66% probability of success. And we can come back to this on what's a good number here, but all that to say is it jumps by about 50%, which is a great starting point. Another thing to note, and then I'm going to get some feedback here from you real quick, is there's a lot of research on retirement spending. And you even mentioned this at the beginning of, hey, we want to retire. We want to be able to travel. We want to do cool things. You're probably doing a lot more of that at age 60 than you are at age 80. What we're doing is we're saying we're going to take this $9,500 and just adjust it for inflation over time. There's research on this. It's called the retirement spending smile, where on average, the median retiree isn't actually just taking that spending amount and perfectly adjusting it for inflation. Inflation is still certainly happening, but retirement spending starts to slow a little bit over time. And on average, if inflation increases by 3%, retirees' actual spending tends to increase by about 2%. I don't like to start with that because that's average. Not everyone's average. Some people will keep up with expenses or even spend more on certain things in the future. But if we were to say, instead of projecting out inflation adjusted spending, what if you did the retirement spending smile? Not only is this 6.2 million here, but now it's a profoundly different projection and profoundly different probability of success than it was before. Does that make sense? Or any questions on that before I continue?
No, that makes sense. And I did change some of the monthly expense numbers, and I did see what an impact that made long-term for the total amount of assets in the plan. But I wasn't sure about whether it was gaming the system or making the numbers look right to get the right result in terms of the Monte Carlo analysis that I wanted, or what was realistic. That goes back to my initial questions about what are expenses going to look like 5 years from now. I think everything you're saying is probably correct, that there are some that will be going down, but I didn't know how much that would be. I didn't know, what was legitimate assumption in terms of decreased expenses versus trying to game the system.
Very fair. Yeah, you can manipulate these numbers in any which way to give a much rosier projection. So the goal, of course, is to be as accurate as possible, probably err on the side of being conservative in certain areas of just things that you can't fully predict. But one of the things I'd rather do is say, yeah, let's take out the mortgage and children's expenses, because that's unless you get another mortgage or unless kids live with you for all retirement, things are very, very highly unlikely, maybe impossible in some ways. That's great, but let's also look at other expenses, like your joint vacation goal. Ideally, you wanted to be able to increase that. Now, I'm just going to, for the sake of simplicity here, say, what if that's 40,000 per year instead of 20? What that could look like is, instead of doing 40,000 every other year, you're doing 20,000 every single year, but it's doubling the budget that we had before. What you can look at is with that, it's less than you would have had, but you're still in a much better position than the beginning, where, in my opinion, you were probably over projecting certain things. And so let's plan for more there on an expense that is very likely to happen and remove some expenses that aren't. Any questions on this so far? Anything that you would like to see different before we go back to the tax piece?
No, that's making sense so far. I would be very interested in seeing what the decreased monthly expenses, what that impact looks like on the need for Roth conversions and the taxation end of things, because I've got to imagine that's going to change that picture substantially.
It is going to change that picture. And that's why I wanted to start with that. If you recall, I still have this toggled on to 12%. In the last scenario, that actually lost you money. If you converted that, it's the system saying you're converting too much. Part of that is because the system's saying you don't have enough to confidently get to the end of your retirement. So these conversions, where you're burning through more cash up front via extra tax payments, might end up costing you in terms of your portfolio's ability to last. Now, that initial projection was based upon overly inflated data, which we just revised. Now, if we look at doing that same exact conversion, it's likely to save you over $500,000 in terms of tax adjusted ending portfolio balance. This is one piece I really want to emphasize to people. There's this sense that, I should be able to map out my Roth conversions today, know exactly what that's going to look like. When the Roth conversions are the things that we should be looking at, but there's an order of operations. We have to get our expenses right. We have to understand what the portfolio is going to grow by. We need to know what inflation is going to look like. We need to know what tax brackets are going to look like. Some of these things we can have some certainty around, like maybe expenses, we can really dial that in and get a very close approximation. Others are totally out of our control. But if we just start with this, too many people start with this, over-engineer this, and miss out on the fact that, wait, we got to revisit the retirement income side first to make sure that that's reporting accurately. Otherwise, you're going to over-convert or under-convert as we go through this. As we go through this, we can even start to increase this to 22%. And what we start to see is, okay, at that point, maybe you start to cost yourself by doing it. This Roth conversion is a very delicate game of everyone should consider it, but not everyone should do it. Even people that do it, you shouldn't necessarily do it forever or fill up the entirety of a certain tax bracket. I almost like to think of this as a lever. If we look at, again, this is what your taxable income is projected to look like, Andre, if you don't do any Roth conversions. You're going to be in a higher tax bracket today because you and your wife have income coming in. Spikes a little bit in the middle of retirement once you burn through some of your taxable accounts and start living fully on IRAs. And then it really spikes again at the end of retirement. Well, instead of those spikes, can we pull some of the income that you would have been paying in the future at higher rates into the valleys, into the crevasses, so to speak, where you're paying a lower tax bracket at 10%, 12%, 22%. And so it's almost like a lever where if this is what it looks like, okay, higher taxes over time, well, can we start to pull the lever like this to shift the balance of more income today to almost like stuff it under certain tax brackets in a very strategic way, but it's not necessarily just more conversions better. It's about finding that sweet spot as we do it. Any questions on this before we look at the Medicare side of things?
I would just be curious how to massage out that lump about 62 years old there, and when to start paying attention to what that number is going to be and when to make that conversion to realize the most efficiency there.
So this lump is more driven by spending than it is tax strategy. And if we go back to your cash flows, I believe that was age 65, if I recall correctly. It was, so age 65, what's happening? Well, expenses are the same. We're projecting 12,000 just adjusted for inflation over time. There's this extra goal, and that extra goal is, okay, well, there's a vacation. And so this is now factoring in like the 40,000 per year that we projected, not the 20,000 per year. And there's a gift to family. And what's being modeled out is, okay, by this point, there are no more brokerage assets. So if we're going to spend more has to be pulled from the IRAs. So a simple enough way of thinking about that is, can we pull half of that out the prior year to start saving for a vacation and smooth that out? So some tax strategies, not just Roth conversions, it's even, we know we have this big expense coming up. Can we normalize the cash flows to save for it before it comes and we're forced to spend 52,000 on vacation and 26,000 on a gift, so on and so forth. So does that answer your question?
Yeah. So a way to normalize that, or would you recommend syncing accounts for that in terms of normalizing that spending over several years' time?
Syncing accounts, or even just quite simply, you're 65 and you're going to take a vacation in January of your 65th year. Okay, in December, can you pull out $26,000 from your account? And then in January, can you pull out $26,000 from your account? So it doesn't need to be a formalized sinking fund. That works for a lot of people. It can just be, we know a big expense is coming. It could also be, hey, we do want to help children with down payments. Can we shift this gift to this year when there aren't other big expenses, or shift it to this year when there aren't other big expenses? So part of it's just a tactical decision right there.
Fair enough.
Back to this distributions here. So that's one component. Again, there's other tax components we need to look at. Capital gains tax brackets. I'm going to zoom in here. One thing that a lot of people need to think about, this isn't really what I'm saying. This is more relevant, Andre, if you were to have a lot more in a brokerage account and a lot less in pre-tax accounts. It's maybe tax gain harvesting that you're more mindful of, and less so Roth conversions. This orange bar says this is the taxable income amount at which anything below it, any taxable income below it, if you realize long-term capital gains up to that threshold, they're completely tax-free at the federal level in the 0% tax bracket. Anything between this orange bar and the yellow bar, you're in the 15% federal tax bracket. Above it, you're in the 20%. So you could look at if your portfolio composition was different, maybe not doing so many Roth conversions or just being strategic about timing of when. And in these years, saying these are the years when I want to start unwinding some of the unrealized gains that I have, which ties into portfolio strategy and some other things, but different components that we want to consider. Medicare premium tax brackets. I will say a lot of people maybe overestimate the negative impact of IRMA surcharges on their plan simply because they don't typically start until modified adjusted gross income north of 200,000, at least for married couple. And a majority of people aren't going to have modified adjusted gross income above that amount unless they've got a more significant portfolio balance and we're doing more significant conversions. But this is another tax that we need to consider. So if we go back to saying we're going to convert, it looks like converting up to the 12% bracket. In your case, looks like it makes a lot of sense right now. You can see that previously you would have been in the higher IRMA surcharges later on in retirement. If you do some of these conversions, not only does it help with income taxes, but it lessens the degree to which your future Medicare premiums will also be hit by some of those surcharges. So win-win in that case. It's not just the federal tax savings plus potential tax, state tax, depending on where you live, of course. There's also Medicare stuff. Any questions as this? As I want to start to make sure we're wrapping it up and addressing some specific questions after going through that. But any questions here?
Where do you tend to lean on? My wife has an ESPP plan through work, mostly employee purchased stocks in that account, but there's also some restricted and unrestricted stock grants in there too. Where in the panoply or where in the serial nature of pulling out from those investments do you tend to do that earlier? Or do you tend to do that? Do you do that earlier in the taxable accounts, like where you look towards the brokerage for income, or do you mix that in later years, like you were just showing with regards to avoiding the IRMA surcharges?
So it starts even earlier than that. It starts upon those plans vesting. My first question is, what do you do as soon as those RSUs vest? What do you do as soon as those ESPPs vest? For those people listening that are unfamiliar, this is just a type of stock compensation in addition to base salary bonus. I think of it as, let's assume your wife's going to get $20,000 in restricted stock units and those vest. Think of it as you got a $20,000 cash bonus. Would you take that $20,000 cash bonus and purchase your company stock with it? Or would you take it and do something else? Invest in a diversified portfolio, pay down a mortgage, fund college plans, whatever it might be. So start with that as a question. And if the answer is, oh, I would purchase my company stock, well, then great. Keep your vested RSUs in the company stock because that's what you would have done anyways. But if not, then it probably makes more sense to sell those restricted stock units because there's no benefit to keeping them. You owe ordinary income taxes on that as soon as they vest. So at that point, it's if you sell the day they vest, assuming you're not under any trading restriction or trading window where you can't sell, no benefit to keeping, unless of course you're going to guarantee a growth rate or anything from there. So to me, Andre, it starts more with what are you doing as soon as they vest, and trying to start building out the right portfolio with them at that point, as opposed to keeping them and then trying to see how do you unwind them at a later point. But that's more of a portfolio decision than a withdrawal strategy decision, I would say.
Okay.
Any other questions on any of this?
No, it's a lot to chew on. And again, the way expenses impact the long-term feasibility of the plan and the way both of those impact Roth conversions. For me, again, that goes to the difficulty of getting one's head around what expenses will be and therefore what the most tax efficient approach will be to building a portfolio and using that portfolio in retirement.
Absolutely. I think that in general, if I was to summarize it, the biggest action item, even to help with the tax planning side, is not to start with the tax stuff. It's to start with what is it going to cost to retire? Go through a spreadsheet of here's our expenses today. Which of these expenses are going to stay consistent in retirement? Which are going to go up, AKA travel or things like that, which are going to go down. The grocery budget. The mortgage is going away. So start with that because that really becomes the foundation of everything else. Once you have that, then you can get a much better sense of, as you look at these tax projections, hey, I'm based upon the frequency that I want to do family gifting, or that I want to do travel, I want to do purchase a new car. Can I stagger those in a way so they're not all coming out in the same year? And just because we model all those three to come out in the same year, for example, doesn't mean that you actually have to spend it that way. But ideally, how can I try to make income more consistent so that when I plan my withdrawal strategy, I'm not modeling out these significant jumps in income that are unnecessarily pushing me into higher tax brackets. And then once you have that, you can start to see, okay, where does it make sense to convert or to what tax thresholds? It certainly looks like 12% makes a lot of sense in your plan. If there's any year that you're under that, it makes a lot of sense from what we can see to convert up to that tax bracket. There may be other years where it makes sense to convert up to 22% tax bracket, but it's driven by the expenses that you'll have. In a lot of ways, it's driven by what the market does between now and that point, because obviously the higher your portfolio value, the greater the impact of those required distributions in the future if you don't implement a Roth conversion strategy to help mitigate that.
Yeah, makes sense. It makes sense. And for me, that'll be my project will be to kind of hone in on some of those. I did watch your video on budgeting. I also hate budgeting, but I think I'm going to have to get my head around that.
Yeah, and it's your system doesn't have to change from what you have today. If it's working today, same thing can work in retirement. It's just the thing that's changing is identifying how much income is needed to cover expenses. That's the biggest thing of just projecting that out, and then that will at least help the projections follow. So any other questions before we start to wrap up this episode, Andre?
Just some kind of granular questions about the expenses. I did budget for some home maintenance expenses in there, and I didn't know whether my stab in the dark on that was realistic or not. I was just wondering if there was any other expenses that you could look at and say, this really looks out of whack.
It doesn't look out of whack. Part of it depends upon, I don't know the age of your home, how well things are kept up, even specifics of the county or state or things that you're in of various weather patterns. So I think it stacks up. It's one of those things I'd rather overproject, because if you don't end up needing it for a home improvement, that's more travel money. That's more family gifting money. That's money that can just be allocated to another goal because you've already factored it in. So it doesn't hurt to overproject just a little bit on those expenses.
Okay.
Well, very good. Well, Andre, thank you very much for joining us on today's episode of Retirement Makeover.
James, it was a pleasure. And thank you again for all the time.
You're very welcome. Thank you. Root Financial has not provided any compensation for and has not influenced the content of any testimonials and endorsements shown. Any testimonials and endorsements shown have been invited, have been shared with each individual's permission, and are not necessarily representative of the experience of other clients. To our knowledge, no other conflicts of interest exist regarding these testimonials and endorsements. Once again, I'm James Knoll, founder of Root Financial, and if you're interested in seeing how we help our clients at Root Financial get the most out of life with their money, be sure to visit us at www.rootfinancialpartners.com.